Welcome to WDUR 1490 AM, and you're listening to Leaders and Legends. This is your host, Steve Rao. I'm Mayor Pro Tem of Morrisville, and I'm proud to be a part of this community. And in the house today, we have one of the main leaders, one of the major leaders in our community, the Reverend Dumas Harshaw, who's a pastor at First Baptist Church and also the chairman of the Triangle Martin Luther King Committee and a very close friend of mine. So, Reverend Harshaw, we welcome you here today to the show, and thank you so much for being here. We know you're a busy man.
Well, thanks so much, Councilman Rao. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you, but particularly to be in fellowship around this show and the meaning of it in light of what's happening this weekend with the Martin Luther King celebrations.
That's exactly what I was going to tell you, say to the listeners, is that as we had talked about last week, there have been a series of events coming up next week around the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And before I introduce him and ask him to talk about his background, what brought about this friendship between Reverend Harshaw and me was he reached out to me last year to be a part of the Triangle Martin Luther King Committee. And my great-grandfather, Dr. U. Rama Rao, was a legislator in India and then went on to join Gandhi's civil disobedience movement. And his son went on to become the mayor of Tamil Nadu or Chennai, and then became the Minister of Transportation, Speaker of the House. And so there was this connection between Gandhi and India and the civil disobedience movement that my family participated in with Dr. King. And Pastor Harshaw and I felt that this strong connection, and being a public official, he got me more involved. And so last year I had the honor of delivering a reconciliation prayer, and it was just wonderful to be a part of the festivities. And since that time, we've invited Pastor Harshaw to speak at our Gandhi Jayanti celebration in October. He gave the keynote address, and it was so nice to see a connection of a guy that's spearheading some of our civil rights movements initiatives here in the Triangle to talk at Gandhi's birthday about social justice. And so this is an ongoing partnership, and we wanted to kick the new year off with having you on this historic show, so we thank you for that. And before we get into the events and a little bit more about the mission of Triangle MLK, could you just talk a little bit about your background? You are a minister, but a little bit about where your family came from, your education, and what brought you to Raleigh.
Yes, I'll be honored to. I was born in Springfield, Illinois, and when I was 10 years old, we left Springfield, moved to Pasadena, California, where I grew up with my three sisters and my mother and my father. And I was educated on the West Coast, and then got the call to ministry when I was a very young adult, and started seminary training there, but also did a lot in the community in terms of helping the least of these in those days with young people who are caught in some of the urban problematic areas in Southern California, where there's gangs and violence and drugs, etc. And had an opportunity to work as a chaplain in the juvenile hall and the justice system while I was there as a minister, and then worked with a parachurch organization called the Pasadena Youth Christian Center, where we intentionally reached out to some of these young men who would normally be on the track, not only to prison, but also to gang activity. And that's kind of how my ministry began. And then eventually, I processed into professional roles as assistant pastor and pastor of a church there, Trinity Baptist Church in Los Angeles. And then my wife is a teacher. She's always taught school. She was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, and she has family in Los Angeles. And we met there at Trinity Baptist Church and began a family together. We have 3 children, 2 girls, 1 boy. And we left in 1993, receiving a call from the American Baptist Church's headquarters, USA, in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. And I accepted a position as area director for Africa for the denomination. And then later, my responsibility included Europe and the Middle East, and stayed there 3 years. But we did sense a call to return to the pastoral ministry, and a friend of mine told me about First Baptist Church, and we applied, and the Lord called us to First Baptist. And this September, it'll be 20 years since I've been senior pastor of First. Yeah, believe it or not, 20 years since I've been at First Baptist Church Raleigh on Wilmington Street.
Now, how many years is many of these churches? What's amazing is if you go to these churches, they're very historic. So, how long has First Baptist been in the Raleigh area?
Yeah, well, this year we're looking at 204 years.
My God, 204 years.
Yeah. It started as an integrated congregation of 14 former slaves and 9 former slave owners, and up until 1868, it was one church integrated, and then the former slaves asked permission if they could start their own church, and so then they started First Baptist Colored Church, but yet through the years they maintained the same name, First Baptist, and so our sister church is across from the Capitol in the capital city of North Carolina, and it's First Baptist Church. It's on Salisbury, and then ours is on Wilmington Street, but the same history up through 1868. It's an amazing story.
That is amazing. I mean, and so if you're ever in Raleigh, you do see the 2 First Baptists, and so this, now that makes sense. And
right.
Now, and before we take a break, and then we're going to get in a little bit more about your role on the MLK committee and when you assumed that role and the kinds of things you guys are doing. I've been to your church services. They're just wonderful. He's a remarkable minister, and the choir is amazing. The sermons, the music. Has a lot of this been passed on from historical generations? I mean, I can't even imagine 200 years ago when we were a segregated society. We were living in North Carolina with slaves. These slaves and these African Americans must have been coming to this First Baptist for hope, for inspiration.
Yes, exactly. Those living around found in churches like First Baptist a sense of status and beginning and affirmation of their history and their personhood, and it gave them opportunities as well. And as time went on, you had so many people from the rural areas coming to Raleigh in order to go to school at the historically black colleges, and so often they would stay, and many of them who were educated would find churches like First Baptist to continue to stay at, to assimilate. In those years, former slaves wanted to assimilate into the larger white culture. Things are a little different nowadays, but in those days that meant a lot, to learn the English language correctly, to matriculate at the fine schools that were available. They didn't have all the schools available as young people have today, and so they saw themselves as then moving into those social roles of acceptance, dealing with segregation, but looking toward integration. And First Baptist was one of those outstanding churches that modeled that in so many ways. You had so many professional African Americans who have been there for generations, and First Baptist continues in that mode.
Well, that's fantastic. We're really pleased that you're in the area, and it's a great place to come and hear your eulogies and your sermons, and I love the way you apply it to what's going on in the world, and it's really wonderful. So we're going to take a quick station break, and then we're going to come back and talk a little about the Triangle MLK Committee. You're listening to Leaders and Legends on WDUR 1490 AM.